Hey, you have Patrick Findaro, co-founder of Visa Franchise. Excited to have on my friend, Steve Maggi, an immigration attorney that we've worked with for, 7 years on multiple cases with. Always happy clients. So Steve, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's great. We've had a wonderful collaboration, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to some of the viewers about what's happening and what paths exist for them, because a lot of them don't know that there are potential long-term paths to their short-term situations.
There's a lot of opportunities, and I think you do pretty serious volume for a law firm that's not like a gigantic law firm where you have some serious, employers that you represent, big chains that you're doing a lot of H-1Bs for or different green card options. So you see a lot of volume. You've done a lot of visas. We've mostly worked on E2 visas together.
Yeah.
That was part of the reason why I wanted to bring you on, is you have experience across these different visa categories, as well as the big thing is like people move here generally on a non-immigrant visa, like the E2 visa.
Right.
But most of the time, then they want to stay. And even if the business is doing incredible, the spouse is super happy, the kids are doing an amazing job in school, it's always in the back of the mind. Well, what happens, if something happens to the business or something happens to my job, if they're on H-1B or L-1, what can they do? They want to get the green card. So I think that I always advocate people earlier in the process, you should have a plan to get a green card. And working with Steve, I'm confident, within that first 5-year period of the E2 visa or shorter, you should be able to get a green card if you plan it out right. And it might take some time, but you need to plan it out right and don't shut doors from the beginning. So
yeah, I agree with you. There is that rare client that I like, my first E2 ever back from Buenos Aires, from Argentina in 2004, that told me straight up he did not ever want a green card. And when his child was about to turn 21, they were going to move to Spain. And so we ended up getting 3-5-year E2s, and then they moved to Spain. That's not what typically happens, especially with people who do have children who age out at 21. They want to all have green cards by that time at the latest. The E2, you mentioned other visas, but the beauty of E2, and that's how I started my practice, right? I was based in Buenos Aires for 8 years as a US attorney. And so I did a lot of them there. It's about self-empowerment. What I just learned, and what we see now with the big layoffs from tech companies like Google, is that you're not really empowered when you're sponsored for an employment-based visa where the sponsor is solely responsible for your destiny, right? And if you get laid off, you may have 30 days or 60 days to scramble, but maybe your kids are in school and your spouse is working, and all of a sudden you have to plan moving out of the country because you didn't have a self-sponsored visa. So
60 days to find a job. The US is a very fluid job market, but 60 days, I mean, that's tough. You're probably going to settle for something that you're not a great fit, you're not fulfilled in, and at a fraction of what your prior salary was.
Yeah, you may get undercut in terms of salary. You may find employers that then choose US citizens or green card holders over you, specifically because they don't want to pay filing fees or go through any sort of immigration process. So it's not just having a job that you find, but a category of visa that you qualify for, and also a sponsor that is willing to go through all the paperwork to sponsor you. And so what we always preach, and why we love entrepreneurial-based visas like E2s, is self-empowerment. It's up to you. Once you get that E2 visa, it's in your hands. If your business goes well and you meet those projections that are in your business plan, you can always renew. And then you start thinking about, like you said in the beginning, how do you take that platform or some other skills or abilities that you have or your spouse and convert that into permanent residence? But that's what we shoot for first. And so the alternatives for anyone who's on any visa long-term is always, to me, the best categories are the ones that you can self-sponsor. So, I'm happy to talk about those.
Yeah, you said it so clearly that I haven't heard before, but ultimately, you want to be in control of your own destiny. And a lot of our clients at Visa Franchise were entrepreneurs and business owners in their country. And it's hard, to go back to being an employee. It's just a different mindset, and especially in a different country. where we have had a lot of clients have success where they do the investment and their spouse had more of the employee mindset, and the spouse is able to get work authorization from day one, which is a nice change over the last couple of years. So you have the entrepreneur that's kind of more on a roller coaster, maybe some months making 5K, 10K, some months not making any money or losing a little money. And then that spouse has that nice salary that can count on for 6K, 7K a month to help sustain the family.
Well, the beauty of E2 and also L1 is that as of January 14th of 2022, the spouses automatically got an annotation on their I-94s with an S at the end, which designates them as being able to work. And they didn't have to go through that 7-8 month process or however long it takes for USCIS to process an employment authorization document when they entered, which happened for the 18 years I was practicing, where you would have spouses that were really able and capable, but they didn't have authorization to work to do. And the beauty of that is that now they're in the labor market, and that opens up a possibility, if the self-sponsored green cards aren't possible, for them to get sponsored through what's called the labor certification, and then add their spouse, who's the principal E2 visa holder, as the dependent spouse on an adjustment of status. So that's another thing that we've seen in the past year that's opened up more, where the spouses can sort of take the reins and be the responsible one or the principal applicant, while their principal E2 spouse is still running their business. So, that's an option. But what we look at first is always exhausting all the possibility of self-empowered and self-sponsored visas where there's no requirement.
Exactly. How I see it, like summarizing, and then I'd love to go in the self-sponsors. You have EB1A, EB1C for certain individuals, EB2 and IW, and then kind of more reliant EB3, and then back to self-reliant EB5 for certain cases, as well as EB2 through the perm. So we'd love to maybe on the self-reliant side, like kind of break it down for those folks that aren't familiar with those green card options.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just give them names because it's easier for people to remember. So the first one that I work on a lot is what's called extraordinary ability. And what that really has to do with is recognition in your field. So we have, for example, we had a case where there was a principal and their spouse was an artist, and they wanted to run the business, but we realized that when doing the analysis that the spouse had enough of the requirements and recognition and media coverage about them, proof of productions, working for companies with distinguished reputations, having success in their field, no matter how small or big their field might be. If you can show that they're nationally or internationally recognized in different ways, they can qualify for self-sponsored green card. So we ended up doing a self-sponsored green card, EB1, extraordinary ability, and then they together were able to get their green cards. And you have to show when you go through the green card process that it's a real marriage and show proof of what's called bona fide marriage and all that. And of course we did that. And now they thought they were coming in on E2 and running a business, but now they're doing separate things, and she's working as an artist. They both have their green cards. So it's always nice to explore that. And I think the perfect fit between E2 and this EB1 extraordinary ability are the entrepreneurs. The entrepreneurs that have a track record, like they were CEO, CFO, or managing partner, or some important position within other internationally based companies that had, success and that have a distinguished reputation. Maybe the companies they worked for won awards, and perhaps they were actually covered in the media. A good example here, Patrick, of what we're talking about is an E2 client that I had that started a business. It was an extension of what he started in Italy. He got bought out by Google. And as you know, Google just laid off 12,000 people, 3 of which were our clients. So we had to scramble in 60 days, get him an O1 visa with a sponsor. And now we're doing the EB1, so he's self-sponsored and he can start his own business again. He actually got bought. Then they hired him on the O1, and then they fired him, and then he had 60 days to scramble. And that's a perfect way of showing how what we would have originally done is just go from the E2 to the EB1 extraordinary ability. But then he took, he got all excited about working for Google and forgot about his own individual plan. And he said to me, I don't ever want to be in this situation again where I'm jobless and I'm not in control of my own destiny. So that's a great example.
Another way that we've seen, like, because I see with startup businesses, and yeah, you could do an O1, you could do an L1, whatever, but if it goes really, really well, probably going to sell. If it doesn't go well, you're going to close it. You lose the VC either way. So we have had clients where the spouse has kind of like an anchor, boring, unsexy business franchise for their E2, and that's the mainstay. And then the technologists in this case can take those risks and try to hit one out of the park.
Right. So that goes back to what you were saying about having a short-term and a long-term plan. And the other EB1 category that people don't think about, and you've seen, because I know that you guys work with L1 sometimes.
We've had probably 30 of those, the EB1C category, where they've gotten the green card because they have a sizable company abroad, and
exactly
the E2 visa business it meets the affiliate requirements.
So for people that don't know the E2 L1 distinctions and are watching for the first time and just starting to explore their options, what's important to keep in mind is that there's a few moving parts here. When you have an existing foreign business and you set up a US subsidiary, which can be used to purchase a franchise, for example, like a lot of the ones that you guys do, that's perfectly viable. But you get what's called a new office L1, which is only for 1 year. And then there are extremely high expectations to get renewal. It's to get a renewal, to essentially create an entire layer or hierarchy under you that removes you from what's called day-to-day activities to be able to
go what? Basically 0 to 10 or 15 employees in a year.
Yeah,
where there's some businesses that justify that, but a lot are 0 to 3, and then the next year 3 to 7.
Exactly. And so it's not doable unless you can scale up exponentially, like you said. Not something you would have done organically in 3 or 4 years. Do it in 1 year. So what do people do? They use their existing business overseas to set up a subsidiary to prove the investment, and then they apply for a 5-year or a 3-year. And that depends, for the viewers, just so they know, that depends on what country or what nationality, what passport you're using. There's something called reciprocity. Some countries like Canada will get 5 years. If you can convince them that you have a good plan, you can get a 5-year E2 right off the bat. But if you're French, it's 25 months. If you're Dutch, it's 3 years. It's always subject to change also, like in the situation with the Dutch, where it just changed a few years ago. And the value all of a sudden was, oh, should I do 1 year or 5? Now it's 1 versus 3, right? So it's great for people to know this, though, that because you choose the E2 path, does not exclude you from getting the EB1 multinational manager or executive green card. People think that you have to go from L1 to EB1. That is actually not the case. As long as your foreign company is continuing to operate, you have that 1 year of continuous time that you worked there on payroll before you came to the US, and you're growing the US business, you can qualify for an EB1 multinational manager or executive green card, even though you're on E2. And if you have 3 or 5 years and you've ramped up the business, you're in a great position to not have to renew your E2 at all, because you got it through that what's called intra-company transfer green card.
And premium processing now is what, like 45 days? You can get an approval for that green card category?
No, because there's no premium processing for EB1 executives or managers at this time. So you're looking at somewhere around 9 months to process that. And what we do, and what we do with a lot of our clients, if we have a really strong case, we do concurrent filing, which means, for our viewers, that means you're doing what's called the adjustment of status at the same time, which allows you to transition to green card, and then you can get a work authorization within 4 or 5 months. So if you're in your last year of E2, you still have enough time to transition into green card and cover yourself, because you're in what's called pending adjustment status. So it's wonderful. And I always ask, I just had a consultation 2 days ago where these Dutch folks that have an E2 visa for 3 years asked me, and I said, well, what about foreign entities? And they said, oh, we have a Dutch and a Singapore entity, and my husband was on the payroll for the last 2 years before we came. They chose the E2 because it gave them a longer initial period, but they still qualify for the EB1 which is based on multinational executives or managers that are transferred. So that's great news. A lot of people think you have to go L1 to EB1 for that category, and it's not actually the case. So you can do E2 and still get that green card that way.
So you've gone through a lot. You've gone through the multinational manager, executive. You've gone through that talent, technologist, top artist, the EB1A category.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about the national interest waiver.
Yeah, this is becoming kind of a popular option right now, and I'll tell the viewers this: if someone qualifies for EB1 extraordinary ability, I always go that route, because the requirements for the national interest waiver are a little bit more gray area, and that leaves more room for USCIS, for Immigration Service, to find an excuse to deny the case. The most important concept here is what it's called, right? National interest. You have to show that your employment in the US will benefit the nation as a whole. And I think that's difficult, but the beauty of it is, Patrick, is if you are on E2 and your business is doing well, especially if it's a franchise that has the ability, based on its agreement with the franchisor, to expand to different markets, you have a beautiful argument for our plans are to expand, to reinvest what we're making in terms of profit, to expand to different geographic areas. And that's the economic-based argument that is impossible to refute. We have other cases where, for example, somebody's spouse is a pilot, and now there's a lot of people during COVID were retired early, and so now there's a need for more pilots, and so you can make an argument in the national interest. But as you know, just like in the E2s that we do, or even the L1s, the most important thing, the bottom line is, will this create new jobs for America?
Exactly. American jobs.
American jobs. So entrepreneurs. So hypothetically, you could be an engineer for this, or some professions that are clearly there's still a need and there's not enough people to fill those important positions. But if you are actually creating the jobs instead of just filling one position, the argument is infinitely stronger. And so I love to do E2s that transition to the NIWs. And so just so people understand, if you're doing an NIW as an entrepreneur, you need to show that you have some sort of track record in business, right? But you could have been somebody that was critical to a company but was never in the spotlight, because the people in the spotlight are the ones that I call the rock stars. They're the ones that are famous in their industries. Those are EB1 extraordinary ability. EB2 NIWs are also exceptional, right? That's the standard, but they don't have to be in the spotlight. And so that's how we make if we can get them on EB1 extraordinary ability, we go that route. But otherwise, the NIW, especially if it's an entrepreneur who already owns a business in the US, works really well.
And we've had EB2 NIW clients that use their business experience in the United States with that franchise to justify the EB2 with success. And then we've also had ones that relied more on their experience in their home country before they moved to the US. And it was less based on the franchise, but other business ideas and other plans of entrepreneurship that they were going to do in parallel together with the franchise.
Yeah, and for both, one commonality between the extraordinary ability and the national interest waivers, you have to infuse into your petitions what's called proof of future work plans. And so they need to have an entire article or essay that they write that has specific projects, ideas. And the more of those that are linked to potential job creation within the US, the stronger is. That's the carrot that you dangle in front of immigration to convince them that not only is it in the national interest or that the person's extraordinary, but that this will benefit the US. And that's always about the bottom line and creating jobs.
Yeah, you unpacked a lot there. So we've gone through, 3 basically self-reliant ways that you can get a green card. And they don't really require much more incremental capital beyond what you did for that initial E2 visa investment, whether it was $100K, $200K, $300K. I'm curious to hear about some of the options that more rely on a U.S. employer, whether it's going to be the spouse, probably most likely the spouse that would be getting a green card through employment.
Yeah, and then maybe we can throw in a little EB5 comment there, because that always pops up. But I mentioned the spouse of E2 visa holders and L1 visa holders. specifically those, because H and O, the spouses are, they call the shopping visa, and which means that they can't work. And so you can't depend on the spouse. But the spouses for E2s and L1s are great because a lot of times they're very capable. They have an education, they have training, they are capable of filling a position, and the employers don't have to sponsor them because they already have work authorization automatically, like you mentioned, right? So that allows them to enter the job market, make a good impression, and then 6 months, 9 months down the line say, hey, would you be interested in potentially sponsoring me for a green card? And that's where they fit into what's called EB2 or EB3, which are these employment-based petitions that do require a labor certification, which is not required for the 3 categories we already discussed, right? And that means that they have to go through an 18 to 24 month period with the Department of Labor to show that they recruited for a specific position, that they couldn't find that candidate, and therefore they're offering the position to this person. And then you submit an immigrant visa petition, right? And then you do an adjustment so you're looking at 3 years potentially that this whole process can take. And so what gets challenging here, Patrick, is the issue of intent, right? Immigrant intent. Once you submit what's called an I-140 immigrant visa petition, you're declaring essentially to the US government that your intention is to become a permanent resident. So when we get really into the weeds here with our clients, we have to figure out the timing of these petitions. A lot of times what you want to do is you want to extend that E2 visa if you're getting close to the end, or you want to make sure that the person comes into the US and they have what's called 2 years of authorized stay. What happens when E2 visa holders enter the US each time, right? Because you could get stuck in a position where you might not get to the adjustment of status phase in time. And that's when you can essentially have your E2 status, or whenever that end date, go by, and you're still in what's called pending adjustment. So it's very important. This is very nuanced, and I don't want anybody to get seasick about all this, but it's important to work with an attorney or a firm that understands the timelines and the timing and which part of which process should come first, second, and third, because otherwise you might exclude yourself where you can't actually finish the process and you can't renew your E2 because it's in the system that you are being sponsored for a green card.
And what do you see like on the perm, the later certificate side? Because like 2018, 17, it was more like 6 to 12 months.
Yes.
And now it's ballooned. Do you think it's going to come down? Have you heard anything?
I mean, I honestly think this all has to do with staffing and budgets. We've seen recently that USCIS is proposing fee increases because unfortunately USCIS, which is the one that adjudicates all the immigration petitions within the United States, for the viewers that don't know, they're self-funded. They get no federal funding. So they have to cover all their costs by increasing the fees, right? And we're so backlogged on so many different categories of cases that they would have to raise a lot of money. And unfortunately, the fee hikes are coming, and they're going to be 20-25%, which is very painful for people.
Yeah. I mean, I sponsored my wife, and it was a lot of money where, I had to pay as an American citizen.
Right. And it's only going to get worse. And you're right. It's family-based cases. It's every kind of case. And so the problem with that is that the Department of Labor is the one that adjudicates the different phases of the labor certification, including what's called the prevailing wage determination. That is now taking something like 7 to 9 months when it used to take 2 or 3 months. And that's what's causing the entire process to get backed up. So you have to understand that while that entire labor certification process is happening from start to finish, which, like I said, is we're averaging 18 to 24 months, you need to make sure where you are with your E2, O1, H1B, or whatever visa you've got, that you're keeping those up to date, you're renewing, you're extending as much as you can. Because once you submit that I-140, it's going to be very difficult after that.
System.
Yeah, if you have an H1B or an L1, you have what's called dual intent. And so if you're applying for a green card, it's okay. It's allowed for you to be in the green card process and still extend or renew, but not for any other visa. And as you know, E2, it's really tricky because to apply for an E2 as a principal applicant, you have to sign what's called a notice of intent to depart. Exactly. You're declaring to the US government that after 2 years, 3 years, 5 you get, depending on what country you're from, that your intention is to return to your home country. Then you sign that again when you go again. But if you have a pending green card case and it's in the system, you can't say that your notice is your intent is to depart. You're contradicting yourself. So the timing is
tricky. We have had 20 or so clients that had a pending I-526 for the EB-5.
Yeah,
and they applied for the E2 visa after and got approved.
Yeah, that's a different scenario, because a lot of those folks they understand that the process for EB-5s are so logged, and that's irrespective of what country you're from, which can add more barriers, right? But you're looking at
this is a good segue. What is the EB-5? Who is that like a good option for? Because it is taking 4 years to process the initial petition. So what's the EB-5 visa, and who's it a good fit for?
I think I might have done the first EB-5 out of Latin America. It was 2006, and it got approved in 4 months.
That's awesome.
And then they got their green card, I think 5 or 6 months later. It was less than a year. Now you're looking at 5 years if you're outside the US, and your money is tied up for years and years until you get a conditional green card, and then maybe you get the money back after you remove those conditions, which could be another 2 years. You're looking at almost a decade for this whole thing for you to get your permanent green card. It's outrageous. So I don't think it's a wonderful option for people. I think it's an option for people that are maybe outside the US and have to live in the US 5, 6, 7 years down the road or more, that are not in a rush and that have a disposable income or assets that they don't have to think about. And at $800,000, for a regional, for one that's within a regional center, for example, or in one of these TEAs where they're targeting, more employment, it's still a really long time to have your money tied up. If you're in the United States, I think that you could probably still extend your visas because of what you said, because of that sort of nuance about EB-5. But the question is, how long do you really want to wait? So you could build, believe it or not, with our Chinese clients, we've done this, and a few Indian clients, we've had them set up a foreign company, invest the same amount of money into building a business, create a subsidiary, get on the payroll, and then the foreign company, and a year later transfer, build the US side, make a lot of money on the businesses that they already have, and then get an EB-1 multinational executive green card in 3 years.
That's a creative approach, especially if you're already doing business between the two countries, and there's probably some way that you get the visa, and it's a great business opportunity for you.
Yeah, I think EB-5 straight is really for those folks, and there are some that are fortunate, not us, but some that are fortunate enough to be able to just move to Waikiki Beach and live there and do nothing. And just be a tourist in between. They won't have any issues. But for 99% of our viewers and potential clients, they're interested in working.
They want to work, make money, and not just chill at the beach.
Right. So it's not the wonderful, golden visa like they used to call it that it once was.
And it's interesting because a lot of these golden visa programs are being shut down. Like last week, the Irish program got shut down. The Portugal program got shut down. Luckily for the E2 visa, it's a treaty. So, to shut down the E2 visa, I think would be really difficult.
It's a treaty, but you've seen the tendencies, right? The adjudications, there are more hiccups in the process. They take longer. There's more denials. There's reciprocity fees. Like if you're Dutch, now all of a sudden you have to pay $2,228 per
I think Australia is really high too, where it's like $4,000. A lot of countries are in like the hundreds, what was $220 and now I think it's going up to $400 or
some are, but they can change that at any moment. And I work with a lot of Dutch clients, and we had cases where they only charge you the reciprocity fee when they agree to give you the visa, which makes sense. But there was no fee when we applied. And then when they got to their interviews after an 8 or 9 month delay because of COVID, et cetera, then all of a sudden they had to fork out $9,000 for the 4 people to get their visas. So that's another barrier. But then the hiccup here is that they finally gave Portugal, which was sort of the lone EU member that didn't have E2 status, they finally granted it through the treaty. But the caveat is that you have to have lived continuously in Portugal for 3 years, or national born in Portugal, right? Or have a Portuguese passport for a long time in order to qualify. And they did that specifically because Portugal had the golden visa. just like Grenada does. We don't want people to buy citizenship in one place and then backdoor it automatically into E2s anymore. And so we have to see how those adjudications come along. But that forces us to be creative and think of other things. Like I said, starting a business in one country, then doing the subsidiary in the US and transferring, because L1, thank goodness, and the EB1 for multinational managers and executives has no country requirements. There are no treaties, right? It's
and
not
some of these
81
countries, like let's just say the Philippines, and you're going to run an offshoring company. What is the cost going to be to have 20 employees and a couple, levels of management? Is that a $100K upfront investment? And then it actually makes sense.
Yeah, I think you know more about it in practice about how.
But it's going to be a lot cheaper than having those 20 employee. The same structure in the US is going to cost a lot, especially if you're buying an existing business. But, in a country like India or Philippines where the wages are a lot less,
Absolutely.
it's a potential strategy to explore where it's definitely not the plan A, but you went through, I think, including the family option that I mentioned, like there's 7 other green cards, and you go down the list, and this is one of the options that if you don't hit the other ones, that you can at least explore and not have to wait 10 years to get the green card status.
Yeah, and that's part of self-empowerment, right? The EB1 multinational manager executive green card, if you run the business and you are that executive or manager, then you're essentially also controlling your own destiny.
Yeah,
and so and you're right. That's a great point. Countries where the cost per employee and to operate businesses is lower allows you to have more capital to invest on the US side. And then you can always make an argument over time that you're moving, you're making the US the headquarters for your business while continuing to have staff. Because that's the chief concern with those specific kind of models, is they might suspect that you don't plan to hire anyone in the US because you are already working with remote workers or people that work in countries.
Well, the nice thing is it can be any industry. Like our first EB1C case was a owner of a couple of gas stations in Brazil, and he invested in an ice cream franchise. Nothing to do with each other, but common ownership.
Yeah, and we've had that with some of our Indian cases where they literally shift verticals completely. Where one had to do with tractor repairs in India, and then now they're doing some sort of web-based platform for what do you call it? For an electronic marketplace in the US. Has nothing to do with the foreign entity, but they're leaving that operating. And then we're going to do the EB1 because they already have something like 11 employees in the US after 2 years. So,
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of industries and businesses that can make a lot of money. Like, give an example, like a restaurant in Brazil where the operating profits usually higher, the percentage compared to revenue compared to the same type of restaurant in the US. And it doesn't make sense to continue doing what made your initial money in your home market. You have to. And we can help you a Visa franchise, and there's other advisors, and we have our platform Vetted Biz, but you have to investigate what makes money here and what's something that you can be passionate about, give you purpose, and that pays the bills.
I always ask people, where do you want to live? Right? Because if you're doing a franchise specifically, you want to find one that has a real opportunity to grow in a specific geographic area where you actually want to live. And then if it's something that's related to one of your passions, you're going to put in 200% because you love it.
Exactly. It makes it easier. And also the hard times, because you have your own business. I mean, there's ups and downs, and COVID, a lot of tough months with that. And if you're really passionate about, I know you are, Steve, about what you do, it pushes through, and those down moments are a lot easier. Where if it's just some business that it's just for the paycheck, you're a lot less likely to push through the tough times.
Yeah, I mean, I personally was fortunate because I do a lot of consular work, and so we had these national interest exceptions and different processes within the embassies that we shifted our attention, and were able to help our clients get into the U.S. despite the different barriers that existed. So, I think it's important for people to work with an attorney that not only knows how USCIS works or labor certifications or visas, but also how different consulates and embassies work, because they all have their own way of applying the law and different expectations. And once you've developed a reputation in some of those consular posts, as we call them, they expect a high level of what you're presenting, and that translates into more approvals. So, I think it's important to have that sort of well-rounded knowledge, as people have already heard, if they don't know this, like Patrick and I know depth because of all the years we've been doing this, but it's very complex.
Yeah, it's like instant credibility, and you got to put your best foot forward. Where I see, if you don't have an advisor, whether it's Visa franchise or someone else, reaching out on your behalf to the franchisors, and you're halfway around the world, good luck getting a timely response and having them really treat you, with care. So like having that advisor, it's analogous to what you do on the legal side of you're representing the client, you have credibility with that consular post, with that embassy, and they're going to take the case a lot more seriously. But I mean, you went through a lot in terms of agencies too, Department of Labor, USCIS, State Department. And then, within State Department, you also have all, hundreds of consular posts and embassies around the world. So
yeah,
there's definitely a lot of moving parts.
Sometimes we have to involve LegalNet, which is the advisory or the review board in Washington, D.C. that's part of Department of State, that sometimes we have to show them that consular officers made a mistake in applying the law and appeal to them. Sometimes, they make mistakes at the embassies, and we have to call in, and make sure that we're contacting the right people and making solid arguments to salvage those kinds of situations. So you have to know pretty much all the ins and outs of all the different cogs, and that includes Customs and Border Protection, because believe it or not, as you know, you could get a petition approved, let's say an L1 by USCIS, get your visa approved at the embassy in Istanbul, let's say. And then when you get to the US, they can deny you entry and say you're not admissible. So you have to be ready to fight on all those fronts.
So I know you're doing pretty serious volume, but beyond the cases that you and your team work at SMA Immigration Law, how do you get that market information? Is it through a network of other attorneys, or how are you further, understanding the different trends that are happening?
Like you said, we pretty much process every kind of, so what we do is we re-engineer our cases based on the tendencies that we're seeing. We don't just plug things into a template and submit them. We're always monitoring, for example, if we get a request for evidence on an EB1 extraordinary ability case, and they ask for something new, and we have to refute that in our response, right? But if we see that that's something that's being asked for consistently, we make sure that we add that. So for L1s, for example, a few years ago, they didn't ask for process documents. Now they're asking for people to show, for example, that they're strictly a functional manager and not supervisory, and that's a big trap. So we know how to avoid that in crafting the duties and explaining them the right way. But we also include process documents, and we reverse engineer the cases so we can show that each step-by-step explanation of each duty and how it's executed is backed up by a document, like an email communication showing, directing somebody how to use this report, for example. It's an insanely high amount of work that is required by us to keep up with the times, but that's what we're always doing. We're constantly re-engineering our cases so that our new clients are getting the best case and the best representation.
And it builds, it builds on everything that you've done in the past. Maybe we could turn it just through a few questions here.
Yeah, of course.
Selva asks, if I invest more, is it more accurate to be granted a green card?
Do we know specifically what kind of visa we're referring to?
I guess overall, like EB1, maybe at the EB1C level or the EB2 NIW. Maybe Selva will clarify.
Yeah. So okay. So I think that it's important to understand that each visa category has a different emphasis. So if it's EB1 multinational manager, right? If you're showing that you've qualified for that, you have to show that the company was sufficiently funded. There's no specific number for that. We've seen cases of 100,000 initial investment, and within a year they're turning a profit and generating new jobs. Up to 31 million. That's the most we've ever done for a case where they were building an entire hotel in New York. And you have to show that it's sufficient. There's that test, right? That asks, have you invested sufficiently to cover all first year operating costs? That's a commonality between E2 and L1. So if you're going for a green card as an as a multinational manager or executive, you've already removed yourself from day-to-day activities. You've created a hierarchy. You probably need at least 7 employees on the US payroll, and you're self-sustaining. So as long as you can show that the company is self-sustaining, whatever the initial investment was sufficient, and there's no need for additional funds. So there's no magic number here. It always depends on the size and scope. If you're going for a green card based on that category, then the number was sufficient. And the most important thing now is you're growing, you have profit, and you're creating jobs, right? It's always about, and even with EB1 multinational executive or manager, Patrick, we're always dangling out the future plans, the future projections, the increase of the revenue, but also the expansion in terms of job creation. If it's EB1 extraordinary ability or EB2 NIW, it's all future facing and perspective, right? It's all hypothetical. And that what's important there, like we talked about, is how you are going to help the economy, right? Not only adding your value as an individual, but what projects do you have that will create jobs? That doesn't require any investment, because it's all about what you will do. So the only one I think that applies here that we're investing is crucial is the initial investment for that EB1 multinational manager or executive, or EB5, which is a bright line. It's either 800,000 or it's 1.05. Yeah, and that's it. And you know, if you're working with the right person, you know exactly how much that is, plus all the fees for the regional and or the franchise or whatever it might be, gets you to the point where you and it's irrevocably, and then you let it ride, right? So that's where you know the number. Where you don't know the number is case by case. It's specific to your business in the US and what you needed to get it to the point where you are now clearly removed from answering and sending a fax, doing the day-to-day things, and your company.
And we have a question, Steve, from Alberto. How about foreigners wanting to purchase a small business like a hair salon or landscaping business to obtain US residency?
Okay. Yeah, well, this is the E2 versus green card distinction is complicated, right? I've done things, what I call a conversion. I don't know if this actually exists as a legal term, but I've done them. An E2, and the person continues to invest. Hopefully they're in a targeted employment area, and then eventually that total investment is above the number that they need, which is 800,000. I did that with a guy who had Crunch Gyms. It was a Mexican E2. So the issue here is, and you guys do this with vetted biz, right? It's hard to convince someone at a consular post, if you're starting with E2, that an existing business is a better option than a franchise. And we might disagree, and we can have a whole separate conversation about this, because you guys really do vet great businesses. But the question with the business that's vetted or already existing that you're buying is, does it have the potential to expand? Because an argument that you're maintaining jobs is not as strong as that you're creating. And if you have a franchise, for example, I think you're saying if not for this investment, these 5, 6, 7 jobs will never be created. And to me, that's a stronger argument. So if I had to choose,
it seems like EB5 definitely better to do a startup. And then if you're looking to potentially get your US permanent residency through acquiring an existing hair salon, landscaping business, EB1C could work. And I think it just, Alberto, is case by case and what you or your client is looking to achieve.
But let's be clear, using that business as a platform first for a non-immigrant or temporary visa, if you want to be in the US and run your actual business, is the way to go. You want a 2-part plan, because otherwise you have to apply for EB5 and 5 years down the line, convince them that the jobs are there. I don't know if that's really viable. If you really want to buy a business, the expectation is that as soon as you buy it, you're getting your visa within a short amount of time to run the company, which means you need a short term, because you can't get a green card or an immigrant visa that quickly based on investment. It's impossible.
And then Mike Smith, how much do I have to invest to get the E2 visa?
Well, Mike, you have asked
How often do you get asked this question? Daily or
every
every other
single consultation for the last 20 years.
day?
That is the question that I always have to answer because, as lawyers are famous for saying, it depends, right? I've done approximately 500 E2s in my life, and I have never done one for less than $1. So I'm not saying that it's not possible, but the most important thing you have to keep in mind is that they expect at a consular level that you're going to create at least 2 full-time jobs in year 1 and then at least 1 in every year after that, minimum. So even if they're part-time, but even if they're minimum wage jobs, you still have to put in $50,000 or $60,000 right there. And then you have all the costs to operate the actual business. And then you have what's called sufficient physical premises, which is, Patrick, is something that still exists as a requirement, but shouldn't, because a lot of businesses are virtual, but they still expect to see you have a physical space where your employees can work. And that also has a cost. And so it's that on top of all the other things that come up, like insurance and miscellaneous costs and marketing. If you want to grow your business, there's no way you're going to do it reasonably for less than that amount. But like I said, I've done them from anywhere from 100 to 1,000 to 30 million. And it really depends on the size and scope of your business. What's most important here is having a very solid business plan, because the final decision is made on the probability of success of the business. Will it actually work? Will it grow? Will it create jobs? And then funding. You always want to put up more money than what you're projecting will be those operating costs. And if it's significantly more, that's even better, because you're showing that you are completely committed to your investment. So it's not so much about the number as it is about what you're actually planning on doing and how you communicate that. And it's important for people to know that they don't necessarily always have to put up all the money. Like that E2 that I mentioned for my Italian client who was fired by Google. Well, he got a grant from venture capitalists. He got money and funding of $1 million to start his US business and didn't put up any of his own money. But it was his business. He owned 100% of it. It was his concept.
He had
his
control,
patents.
which
he
is
had
one
control.
of the requirements.
He had to be the one that run it because he created the patents for products that he was going to create and all this. So you can actually get funding as long as you show the source of funds is legal. You don't even necessarily have to put up the money, but you have to present a very strong business model and then show why you are the only person really capable of running the business.
And then we have Elizabeth is asking, I've heard that in order to get an EB-5 visa, I must create 10 jobs for 10 people. If I purchase a business that already has 10 employees, have I fulfilled the requirement to hire 10 employees? We've touched on this a little bit, but do you want to clarify further?
The answer, according to the statute, is yes. So it is possible, but there's a few things you have to keep in mind. You have to put in at least the $800,000 that's required. You have to do a study and get a certificate from the state where you're going to do your business that says that it's designating that specific tract of land where the people will be working, and they can't be working offsite or in another county or anything. They have to be working there. That it's part of a targeted employment area. And as you know, we see this like gerrymandering. Those lines are always shifting, right? So you have to get an up-to-date letter confirming that, or you have to put in 1.05 million up front and show that you've irrevocably invested those funds. And then the problem here is it's going to take you 4 years to get an approval, and then you might get your green card, and then you have to wait until almost the end of a 2-year conditional residence period to then do a removal of conditions. And at that specific time, and really the year leading up to that petition, not at the last minute, Patrick, you have to show those 10 full-time jobs have been there, which means you're investing in something that will take maybe 6 or 7 years before you have to show the jobs are there. Does anybody have $1 million or 1.05 million to put into a business that they can't run? You're not authorized to run the business till you get your conditional green card. That's why I said in these cases, if you have just a home run, amazing business that will work for this, get your E2 or your L1 to run the business first, build up your investment, then you convert it to EB-5.
And we have from Heather Brown, fast track processing available for EB-5 application. Should I need a comprehensive business plan for the EB-5 visa application?
Absolutely, yes. You have to be, number one, very skeptical about this fast track. All the regional centers online that you see, if you Google it, promise this fast track. They also promise the 526 processing being extremely quick. I don't really buy any of that, to be honest. But going to your question, and so the most important thing, Patrick, you know this because you do it with E2s and with all the businesses that you guys are vetting, which is a lot. The choice of your investment is crucial because your destiny is tied. In EB-5, your money is tied up for so long that if it doesn't work perfectly, you're going to lose your status or your green card, and most likely you probably end up losing the money or some of it as well. So the business plan is extremely important. And if it's based on what's called an econometric model, which means you're aggregating jobs, you need an economist report also to make the argument that those jobs will be created. So you're talking about just literally a mountain of paperwork, and it has to be great paperwork in order to get an approval.
We do very few EB-5 directs. Most of our clients are applying for the E2 visa, and we have had expedited approvals where the attorney makes the case that he needs to get the appointment and the approval for the E2 visa fast because the business might close and there's going to be a lot of Americans laid off. So I would imagine that's kind of a similar type of, when you have an expedited filing and review for the EB-5, it's that urgency. But I would say the majority of our clients have not had success with getting that expedited review of whatever visa category they're applying for.
And you know, I don't know from experience per se. I've done a lot of EB-5s, but that's slowed down a lot because of the delays and everything. That if almost every website that you look up promises it, which means 80 or 90% are promising expedited, but it's given in 2% of the cases or whatever the low percentage actually is, there's something that's not correct there. And yeah, there's a huge disconnect. And I don't want my clients to have $1 million tied up that they can't get back for years if they don't have to. That's why it's about empowering yourself. And if you can do an EB-5, you have a great project where you can run the business on an E2 and then convert it, or you have a multinational situation where you can just get an EB-1 multinational manager. Do that. EB-5 to me is the least attractive option of all the employment-based visa categories.
And then you have two more questions we'll field. Wong An, can you say a little bit about the L1 visa, that non-immigrant visa that's typically tied to the EB-1C?
Sure. Okay, so just the basic things about L1. Number one, it requires that at least 2 entities that are legally connected exist. So the beauty of E2 is that you might not have ever had your own business and you don't have an existing business. It doesn't matter, right, Patrick? You can start from scratch, buy into a franchise, start your own startup. Doesn't matter if you have a foreign business. With an L1, the anchor is the foreign business. And it has to be very strongly positioned. There has to be positive revenue. There has to be a hierarchy of employees. So like I say, 7 or more that are already working for that company. And it has to have existed for at least 1 year because you need to show that you're on the payroll of that company for at least 1 year before you apply. And this is problematic in Europe. Patrick, I don't know if you've seen this, but it's very problematic in Europe because the unions are strong for independent contractors. And a lot of companies prefer to have independent contractors as opposed to payroll employees. And you cannot qualify under any circumstances if you do not have a year's worth of pay stubs leading up to, or in the last 3 years before you enter the US.
It can also be an issue in some markets that are a little more informal, like Vietnam, where sometimes they're employees, but they're not on the records, and the government needs to see that they're on the records and they're properly compliant employees.
Believe it or not, that E2 case that I mentioned about Google, they tried to submit an L1 when he did not have a foreign company, and that obviously didn't work. So we did the O1 for him. So it's amazing how these concepts, somehow people think there's a workaround, or if I put Google or some big name on the letterhead, I'm going to get an exception. It doesn't work that way. So there are certain things you absolutely have to do to set yourself up for an L1. And once you have one, don't forget, if it's a new office, you have to ramp up very quickly. Sometimes we tell our clients, build your US business slowly, get to that 1 year mark. And after that, you can ask for 3 years as your first. And then you don't want to apply for the green card until literally you're removed from day to day. You're at a managerial or executive level. There's people under you, there's divisions. It's a true multinational operation.
You're not the guy selling the service. You manage people that sell the service.
You are
managing people that manage people that sell the service.
You are not supervising anyone. You are reviewing reports. You're developing strategies. You're giving directives. You are not the person that's crunching numbers and doing the basic day-to-day stuff. And you're not supervising X, Y, and Z people, or like a line supervisor in a factory used to actually be a managerial position for L1 or EB1. Now you have to show that each one of those subordinate employees is a professional with a degree. That doesn't work for a lot of businesses, right? So L1, it's very important. You set up L1 on the foreign side strongly. Then you have your base. You set it up correctly in the US, and then you wait your time. My rule of thumb is that once you get a L1 extension approved, that's when it's time you're ready to submit an EB1 immigrant visa case.
Well said. And just a final question here. The funds used for an E2, whether it be 100K or more, can a portion be borrowed from the bank? Since you mentioned the example, Steve, of a client that used venture capital funds and none of his own money to start the business.
Yeah, so the venture capital funds, when you can show, we just got one approved for Canada where we showed the profile of some of these high profile investors, that really helps. It's not conditional. There's no loan there. They're putting in their capital. We don't know what the backside agreement is or any of that, but they didn't frown upon that at all. A loan from a bank, I say it's a 4-letter word. I'm not saying that I haven't seen it, but don't really like to see loans, because then are you really accountable for those funds? And are they really yours? It's about having those funds be, if the loans can be called back by the bank under, like if you default on a payment and they call them, then they're not under your control completely. Better to get a gift, like you have a gift agreement that's legally, and somebody has gifted you the funds, and they may have to eat the tax consequences of doing that, but those are irrevocably given to you, and then they're under your control. They come from a legal, then you can use them. So a loan to me, something to try to avoid, and we have seen, Patrick, especially with our Luxembourg, Netherlands, and Belgian clients, that there's a lot of loan agreements between parents and subsidiaries and the holding companies, and we do not want those involved in these processes, because it's a red flag for officials. They don't like that. They want to see that those are free and clear funds that you're investing.
Well, Steve, really appreciate you sharing all this information. I know we went a little bit over of our allotted time. We have more questions coming in, and someone specifically asking best way to contact you. And so, yeah, what's the best way for someone to schedule a consultation with yourself?
They can email me directly, and I'm happy to extend a 15-minute consultation to anyone who's attended as a courtesy. Usually we charge for those, but we'll see in those 15 minutes if something is potentially viable. So they can write me at SMAGGI, Smaggi, at SMAlawyers with an S.com. And feel free if you send a follow-up email or something to the people who attend.
We just put that in the screen, and we'll
there it is
in the show notes. If anyone's interested in entering contact with Visa Franchise, it's just info@visafranchise.com. Steve, again, thanks so much for joining today and all the work you do for our clients.
Thank you. Great seeing you.